We all share a common enemy: climate change. Melting ice caps and rising sea levels threaten our way of life. But how do we measure the damage and quantify the necessary repairs? What unit of measurement guides us in assessing progress? The answer lies in striving for net zero emissions. What is net zero? Net zero emissions describe a balance between the greenhouse gases produced and those removed from the atmosphere. Imagine a place that emits 20 tons of greenhouse gases annually. Achieving net zero means removing an equivalent 20 tons from the atmosphere. In recent years, net zero has become the primary framework for climate action. As of November 2023, around 145 countries had announced or are considering net zero targets, covering nearly 90% of global emissions. To date, 27 countries have enacted domestic net zero legislation. The concept of net zero emerged from late 2000s research on how the atmosphere, oceans, and carbon cycle respond to CO2 emissions. The conclusion was clear. Global warming will only stop if CO2 emissions are reduced to net zero. What approaches do we need to take to achieve net zero? Reducing emissions. The most straightforward way to achieve net zero is to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases. This involves shifting from fossil fuels to sustainable energy sources, following science-based pathways. Removing emissions, actively removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere through methods like afforestation, reforestation, and carbon farming. Technologies like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, BECCS, and direct air capture also play a role. Purchasing carbon credits. Entities can invest in projects that reduce, avoid, or remove emissions elsewhere. For example, if a factory produces 20 tons of CO2 but lacks the means to offset it, it can purchase carbon credits from another entity that has excess capacity for carbon removal. To explain this simply, let's say, if person A has a factory and this factory produces 5 tons of carbon dioxide in a year, but they have planted trees next to the factory that is capable of absorbing 50 tons of carbon dioxide and converting it into oxygen. The factory is not contributing to the increase of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. On the contrary, it is creating net 45 tons of oxygen. So person A earns 45 tokens for this. Now let's say person B has a factory that produces 20 tons of carbon dioxide, but they don't have trees or any other methods to remove this carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They can buy these 20 tokens from person A to account for a net climate benefit. A carbon credit or offset credit can be bought or sold after certification by a government or independent certification body. While many nations and organizations commit to net zero, the credibility of these claims vary. Without binding regulations, most net zero commitments are voluntary, leading to skepticism. In sectors like steel, cement, and chemicals, the technological pathways to net zero are still unclear. Bhutan, a model for net zero. Countries like Bhutan offer a glimpse of what's possible. Bhutan, with 72% of its land under forest cover, not only achieves carbon neutrality, but goes beyond to become carbon negative. Bhutan produces 2.2 million tons of CO2, but its forests absorb 3 times that amount. Here's how Bhutan maintains its carbon negative status: providing free electricity to farmers to reduce reliance on firewood, subsidizing electric vehicles, reducing the cost of LED lights, promoting a paperless government, protecting over half of its land through national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. Heavily industrialized countries face greater challenges, but they can still draw lessons from Bhutan. Preventing emissions is easier than removing them. But since our economies depend on emissions, offsetting is crucial. To reach net zero, we need everyone to be a net hero.